Hey Axis and Allies players, the good captain here. Welcome to video number 5 in my Axis and Allies 1914 series. This video is unique in that it's not a recommendation on how to play the opening moves of any individual faction. This video is going to be solely focused on the one and only optional rule in this game, and that is the Russian Revolution rule. Now before I get into the content, I need to lay some of the groundwork here. This video is not a detailed description of the rule itself. It's more a look at how the rule affects the game and how to best leverage it to your benefit, whether you're the Central Powers or the Entente. And next, although this is technically an optional rule, I feel that anybody playing Axis and Allies 1914 absolutely should use this rule in every game they play. It's a bit tougher to be the Central Powers in this game rather than the Entente, and this rule does quite a bit to help out the CP if you have a thorough understanding of this rule. Now, unfortunately, at the time of this recording, the rule as written in the manual is incomplete and the official errata is necessary to completely comprehend it. I'll link it in the description box below for reference. But I'm going to go ahead and summarize right now the conditions under which an armistice is offered by the Russian player to the Central Powers. I'll just note right now that the keyword here is offered. The Central Powers never have to accept the armistice. First, it must be on or after turn 4. Second, it must be the end of the Russian turn. Third, 3 or more territories adjacent to Moscow must be controlled by the CP, not contested. Fourth, at least one other Russian territory must be controlled by the Central Powers. 9 out of 10 times this is Poland. And 5, Moscow must not be under Central Powers control. Of these 5 conditions, 3 are of more interest than the other 2. And that is that it must be the end of the Russian turn, meaning that Russia has the final say in what happens on the board. At least 3 territories must be controlled that are adjacent, and that Moscow is not under Central Powers control. Do your best to remember these 3, as they will all come up here later in the video. If or when these 5 conditions are met, an armistice is offered by the Russian player to the Central Powers, and if accepted, all Russian armies and navies are effectively removed from the board, and their IPCs are reduced to 0. Russian territories that remain uncontrolled by the Central Powers become impassable. Any original Russian territories that are contested must be garrisoned by at least 1 Central Powers infantry unit and can only be entered or exited by the Central Powers. This is not the only way to kill Russia, but it is the fundamental strategy as the Central Powers. Deviating from the script I'm about to demonstrate can be interesting, but understanding how this works at a foundational level is imperative. And the key concept of killing Russia as the Central Powers is what I call the Bearhug, or the complete encirclement of the Russian capital by both Germany and Austria in conjunction with an attack on the capital itself. And the 2 territories that are key to this encirclement are Livonia and Ukraine. It's from these 2 territories that the Central Powers gain the most control over the Eastern Front. So in the original concept of this video, I wanted to demonstrate this strategy from the top of Austria-Hungary's turn 2. But after much thought and deliberation, I've decided that's far too tedious, and I think there's actually a better, cleaner, and more efficient way to show this, and that is to use an actual game where I was the Central Powers and my opponent was a competent Entente player. So let me orient you to this board situation. This is the end of Austria-Hungary's turn 3. There are 37 troops, 9 artilleries, and 1 fighter in Galicia. There are 39 infantry, 14 artillery, and 1 fighter in Ukraine. And there are 31 German infantry, 9 artillery, and 2 fighters in Poland. Russia declares that it's purchasing 7 infantry and 1 fighter, and their combat movement is as follows. They push their army into Ukraine and leave blockers here and here. So at the end of their place units phase, they look something like this. That's now 45 infantry and 14 artillery in Belarus. Now if we go back to the previous segment, remember that the key points to the Bearhug are Livonia and Ukraine. And now we can see that Germany and Austria both have access to those 2 pressure points. So hopefully it goes without saying that the German army in Poland will push into Livonia on their turn 3. So at the end of the German turn, we look like this. And of course, when we come around to Austria-Hungary's turn, they move into Ukraine. So at the end of Austria-Hungary's turn, we look something like this. And now let's just take a moment and appreciate this situation. The Central Powers have accomplished the first, most critical step in this Bearhug strategy. They have a large German army in Livonia, and they have a large Austro-Hungarian army in Ukraine. If the Russians attack in any direction, they will expose their capital to capture from the opposite direction. And in this case, my opponent decided to move into Moscow. So at the end of Russia's round 4, we have 54 infantry, 14 artillery, and 2 fighters in Moscow, with a pair of blockers in Karelia, Belarus, and Tatarstan, and a single infantry in Sevastopol. And it's this point here, with the German army fully consolidated in Livonia, the Austrians in the Ukraine, and the Russians in Moscow, Russia will almost certainly be offering an armistice at the end of its round 5. So at the top of Germany's turn, we send in 4 infantry and 4 artillery into Karelia, 4 infantry and 4 artillery into Belarus. That's to give us each a 99% chance of success in those areas. We don't want any contested zones. And every other German piece can start heading back towards the West Front because it's over. So we look like this at the end of Germany's turn. I threw the fighters in just to make sure those 2 territories went down. And now it's Austria-Hungary's turn. And Austria-Hungary is going to do essentially the same thing. We're going to take Tatarstan. And with the balance of the Ukrainian army, we're going to push it into Moscow. Tatarstan goes down. And it doesn't matter at all what happens in Moscow so long as at least 1 Austrian infantry survives. And so when we arrive at Russia's turn 5, the only thing they have available to do is purchase units and destroy whatever's left from the Austrian army. Once they do so, and their turn is over, they must immediately offer an armistice to the Central Powers, which the Central Powers, of course, readily accept. This then eliminates all the Russian units remaining in Moscow, as well as any other Russian territory or sea zone. Sevastopol becomes a territory that nobody can move into or through, as does Moscow, Finland, and Kazakhstan. So at the end of Russia's turn 5, this is how we look. Yes, the Austrians lost the majority of their army attacking Moscow, but it was an inferior army compared to that of the Russians. In other words, we did quite a bit more damage as the Central Powers in terms of peace exchange. And not only that, but the Germans got a jump on the turnaround heading back towards the West Front. So this demonstration is a very basic but solid snapshot of the Bearhug in action. Just to recap what happened here, a large German army stacked up in Livonia, a large Austro-Hungarian army stacked up in Ukraine. This presented Russia with very few good options, and so my opponent decided to pull into Moscow. And from this position, a Central Powers player knows to simply capture all of the adjacent territories to their armies and sack one into the Russian capital. This creates a contested zone from which the Russians cannot move, and essentially you trade one army for the Russian army, with the added benefit for the Central Powers that Russia is permanently knocked out of the game. For the normal Axis and Allies player, there's very little about this move that's intuitive. Contested zones are fairly unique in the world of Axis and Allies, and the purposeful destruction of an army to create a contested zone is also quite novel. Before I close this video, I have to demonstrate one more very non-intuitive counterplay that's available to the Russian player. Okay, to demonstrate this extremely non-intuitive play, I've gone back into the archives and pulled one of my earlier games. The board is a bit of a mess, but just to orient everyone, there is a large Austrian army in Ukraine. There is a large Russian army in Livonia. However, both Livonia and Karelia are contested zones. There's a German infantry in each. And finally, there's a smallish German army both in Poland and Belarus. Notice that there are only 6 infantry on the Russian capital, and it coincidentally is the Austro-Hungarians' turn. Now, as commander of the Austrians, I knew exactly what I was going to do. I'm going to move 7 infantry into Moscow. That way, even if he gets 6 hits, I'll have at least 1 infantry remaining. And then I'll send 5 artillery and 6 infantry into Tatarstan. Everyone else is going to head back to the West Front because there's no way he's going to be able to retake any of these adjacent territories, right? This will spark the revolution and those Russian armies will disappear off the map, right? Let's go ahead and move the pieces. And so we look like this going into Russia's turn. As it turns out, there's a catastrophic problem with this situation for the Central Powers. But before I provide the correct answer for the Russian move, I want you, the viewer, to try to figure it out on your own. Try to solve this Axis and Allies puzzle. Let me help by zooming it in so that you can look at these pieces more closely. This is the top of Russia's round 6, and Russia has the ability to deliver a devastating effect to the Central Powers. So can you see the move? Can you find out what to do as the Russian player? Congratulations to those of you who were able to figure it out. As the Russian player, we're looking to avoid the revolution, and we have until the end of this turn to upset at least one of those 5 conditions. And the answer is, of course, to pull every single troop into Karelia and surrender the capital Moscow to the Austrians. So on the Russian movement phase, we do this. So we look like this at the end of Russia's turn, and if we recall back to the top of this video, remember that one of the conditions of the revolution is that the capital must be Entente controlled or at least contested. In this case, it is CP controlled, so no revolution is offered. Any purchases that the Russians may have made are now exchanged for their cash value. That cash is then transferred to whatever Central Powers player made the capture, and the game continues. And I will say that I've played this game enough times and seen this situation happen enough times that if this should happen in your game and the Russian army essentially escapes to the northwest corner, I would save everyone at the table some time and simply concede as the Central Powers. It's that devastating. So if you recall back to the initial example where the Central Powers successfully bear-hugged the capital, imagine, if you will, even having one territory become contested. That suicide attack that was made against Moscow is now just that, a suicide attack. Whatever survives from the Russian army can simply slip into the contested zone, hand the capital over to the Central Powers, avoid the revolution, and continue to fight with the army that has escaped. And this is both the beauty and the terror of this optional rule. There are many derivative variations of attacking Moscow and defending it. There are times where the Central Powers can and should capture as opposed to set it up for the revolution, but it has been my experience that the side or individual who understands this rule better has an incredible advantage. I consider the lesson in this video to be the absolute most important in this series. Whether the revolution happens or not, taking down Russia is an incredibly important part, especially as the Central Powers. This must be done efficiently and as effectively as possible if you want to have a shot at taking the win in the middle and end game. Taking out Russia is like taking out the minor boss in some video game you're playing. You need to defeat this boss before you can move to the bigger boss, which is the rest of the Entente powers over on the West Front. The true uniqueness of this rule is that it ends up feeling like an over-the-board negotiation with your opponent. Both sides are essentially maneuvering their armies in a way where they're going to try to get a better deal and destroy the enemy at a cheaper cost. At least that's the view from the Central Power side. As the Russian player, you're looking to try to sell your capital as dearly as possible. You want to take up time, you want to destroy pieces, and perhaps in the best case scenario, you have something like this happen, where your army escapes mostly intact to fight another day. And as I wrap up this video, I want to remind everyone that the goal of this video was less a script on how to destroy Russia as the CP or to defend it as Russia, and more to expose these very essential, although very non-intuitive, strategies and tactics, namely executing the bear hug as the Central Powers, and or orchestrating the escape of the Russian army if you find yourself in a contested zone in Moscow as Russia. I did my best to demonstrate this via 2 examples from actual games, and I think I'll close this video by saying this. Although this rule seems fairly simple, there is an incredible amount of depth to it. I think this video exposed quite a bit, but the more you play this game, the more you will uncover different variations of attack and defense. That being said, understanding these core concepts will put you in a better position to gain the ultimate victory. A complete understanding of this rule can easily bring you to victory no matter what side you're on, whereas an incomplete understanding of this rule can very quickly bring you to ruin. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching, all the best from the good captain, and bye-bye.